Hi, peace be upon you folks. I've been seeing the issue about on Nupur Sharma, an Indian politician who has gotten a lot of Muslims angry by what she said. And I've tried to acquaint myself with the situation. So I made a Twitter post about it and I decided maybe I'll do a YouTube post as well. So it's usual for us to view things from a from a philosophical lens, right? We all have a philosophical lens, whether we are aware of it or not. And whenever we look at situations, we tend to judge those situations by what you would say our point of view. And this philosophical lens, you can read more on that, but basically it has been shaped by your upbringing, your culture. So even the way you judge right from wrong has it's like that. So even with me, right? Um, I spent a large portion of my upbringing in West Africa in Sierra Leone. Then I spent from the time I was like 17 to 23, I spent it in the United States, having the Western education and all that. And then I started trying to become more and more familiar with the Quran, right? Like um, in my 20s, right? I was familiar with it, but I started trying to become more familiar with it. And sometimes you would think some things are a little bit too harsh, but then you start to look at the context. You start to read it more and start to change that lens so that you start seeing things from what I would say is the lens of Allah, the lens of the Quran. So sometimes it's judging things from our philosophical lens might not be the best. So we have to remove that lens and try to see things within the context so that we can judge them better, right? That said, I'll just continue with the post and try to look at the age of consent historically. But let me just continue with the post for now. So, in the post, I'm saying I've tried to acquaint myself with the issue of Nupur Sharma and the boycott Indian products. And if I could be controversial, even as a Muslim, one, nobody should insult religious symbols. Even a Muslim should not be insulting Hindu symbols or Buddhist symbols or Christian symbols. And honestly, uh, we have many reasons of which Muslims should boycott India or China or France, etc. Right? There are a lot of valid reasons. So it surprises me that, given all those valid reasons, this is what it takes for Muslims to want to boycott India, right? So, but anyway, I'm saying let's put all that aside and look at the incidents from and looking at this incident. These are my thoughts, right? Putting all that aside, many societies historically have had different ages accepted for marriage. I'm just starting the issue like this. I'm going to address the issue of the hadith and the prophet. Anyway, so I'm saying, yes, putting all that aside and looking just at the incident, these are my thoughts. Many societies historically have had different ages accepted for marriage based on socio-economic fabric, and usually this age of marriage or consent is after puberty. You can do this research, right, of consent. But here's an example from Discover the Truth, right? Age of consent in European and American history, right? So it's trying to address what the age of consent was, and here it's talking quoting Professor Richard Watley and Professor Stephen Smallbone. So both of them state that before the 1900s, girls married very young, and pointing out even Shakespeare's Juliet in Romeo and Juliet was 13. And there is no hint in the play that this was considered exceptional. So basically, this was normal. The situation was similar on the other side of the Atlantic, so in the United States. He reports that the the case in 1689 of a 9-year-old bride in Virginia. And at the start of the 19th century in England, so we're talking about the 1800s, it was legal to have sex with a 10-year-old girl. So the age of consent was 10 years. Also, in the book Sex and Society, it states until the late 20th century, US age of consent laws specifically names males as perpetrators and females as victims. Basically, following this, in the English law, it sets the age of consent to 12 in 1275, and then lowered it to 10 years in 1576. So, in fact, lowered it later. So, the American colonies, also following that English law, generally set the age of consent at 10 or 12. The laws were to protect female virginity and all that. Richard A. Posner, Chief Judge of U.S. Court of Appeals, and Catherine B. Silber, an associate professor at Boston University School of Law, both of them said that before the 1900s, the age of consent was 10 years. The law governing the age of consent has changed dramatically in the United States during the century, they are quoted as saying. And they continue. Most states codified a statutory age of consent during the 19th century, and the usual age was 10 years. So we can go on and on with these examples, but it will become redundant. But we'll see it in that this was not even a long time ago. We're not talking about, BC, or 900, 600 AD or something like that. We're talking about the 1900s. This was not a very long time ago, about a couple of 100 years ago, right? And in fact, less than 100 years ago, right? So what was wrong with those people? Like, we're just looking at the lens of, 18 years is the age of consent. What was wrong with those people that less than 100 years ago, they decided it was okay? Take this also, for example. In 1962, the American Law Institute recommended that the legal age of consent to sex had to be 10 years. In fact, until the mid 1960s, the legal age of consent in Delaware was 7. All right, so 1960s, we're talking about, 60 years ago. What was wrong with those people? These are not 20 generations away from us. These are like our grandparents, our parents, right? So what was wrong with them that this was acceptable to them? So sometimes we have to take off the lens we're looking at. We've all put on this Western lens of the modern Western lens that 18 is the age of consent and that's the best. We have to look at societies, their social fabric, how those societies were. And if you're living in a society, let's say it's mostly farming and hunting, right? And trading, but there are not a lot of schools. There's not a program of people going to school, children going to school at a certain age, learning a trade, Then at the age of 10, what are you doing? What are you doing, right? It's not like you're going to get an education. You get married if you're a girl. So this is their society, right? So if we're going to look at the prophet's time, we have to take off a little bit of our lens of today. Anyway, let me continue with the post for now that I was making. So we've looked at the age of consent in US and Europe for the past centuries. And I'm saying that even Mary, the mother of Jesus, is thought to have been 12 when she married. Mother Aisha, the one who is in question in these hadiths, she had suitors before the Prophet. And even the Jews in Medina who opposed the Prophet and would have otherwise loved to discredit him, they didn't bring this up as an issue, right? So in that time, it was normal that she had reached an age of getting married or being proposed marriage to, right? So even those Jews who would otherwise have wanted to point out Aisha's age, they didn't do it. So for me, those are the facts. And maybe if we can look at the facts of things we know, then we can address the things we don't know, right? So, um, and I'm saying, even when I look at the Quran, right, this is another fact. The Quran offers an exemplary moral guidance. And for me, the truth of the Quran is evidence in itself, right? That it was from God, and God chose the Prophet as his messenger, right? And the Prophet was not an immoral person, right? So we know those facts, or I've accepted those facts, right? And so that said, right, many Muslims have accepted hadiths as they accept the Quran. So, what if you've accepted hadiths and somebody said this hadith? Why are you angry? Why are you angry? For me, psychologically, you would be angry if you think what the Prophet did was wrong, right? So for me, in fact, Muslims are putting a guilt upon themselves. Oh, they're angry after this person quoted a book you've accepted. You've accepted that the Prophet consummated marriage with Aisha when she was 9. So if you don't think there's anything wrong with that and you've accepted this person as your prophet, then why are you angry that she's saying that if you don't find anything wrong with it? So for me, personally, I accept all hadiths with a grain of salt. Just as many books, even historical books of history, may have been altered for someone else's agenda, so too could some of the hadiths have been altered, right? The hadiths were not preserved as the Quran was preserved, right? The Quran was memorized since inception. So you can't just change a book and change the Quran because people have memorized it. And if you change the letters of the book, people will tell you no. There are many hundreds of people who will tell you no, this is not correct. This is not the correct recitation. The hadiths, on the other hand, are not like that. They were not preserved like that. People could have changed it over the years. They were not even written down or memorized and transmitted the way the Quran was. So people have an agenda. Unlike what people think, there is a grand conspiracy, and Satan and his descendants and the Nephilim, they are part of that conspiracy. And even the prophecies that we read and we believe in those prophecies could have been altered for someone else's agenda, so that when they start bringing events to pass, it seems like prophecy is being fulfilled and people will tend to believe what they see, and then they could accept somebody as the correct figure when in fact it's a deception. So who knows what has been changed in the hadith? So for me, it doesn't matter what age the Prophet consummated with Aisha, right? Personally, I don't believe he consummated the marriage with Aisha at 9. I don't believe that, all right? But I believe that whatever he did was acceptable to God because he was the one giving the Quran, and the Quran for me is evidence of God and that it's from God. I believe that. So for me, if God chose him as his prophet and messenger, whatever he did was acceptable to God. The things he did that were not acceptable to God, even God pointed them out in the Quran. Like the time the blind man came and the prophet frowned because he thought he was disturbing him, right? I don't need to get into that. But if in this case in particular, the case with Aisha, it was not just acceptable to God, it was also acceptable to the society of that time. Otherwise, people would have pointed it out. There would not have been suitors or men who proposed marriage before the prophet. So this was acceptable at that time. So to me, this is not an issue. This is something that is just being used for an agenda, and also for Muslims to condemn their own beliefs. Because you've believed that this prophet married this girl and consummated marriage at the age of 9. So why are you offended by that if you don't think there's anything wrong with that, right? Look at something that God found acceptable, but the people of the society didn't find acceptable. I give you an example. The example was the prophet's adopted son, the wife of the prophet's adopted son. After their divorce, the prophet married her. This was unacceptable to the people at the time. They pointed it out. They made an issue out of it. In fact, the prophet was afraid to propose a marriage because he was afraid of what the people might say. And in fact, here is also when Allah said in the Quran, right? Like, why do you fear the people? Fear me. It's not for any believer, when I have decided and you have decided, that they should have a say that, oh no, we prefer something else. You're Muslims. A Muslim means someone who has surrendered to Allah, right? You surrender to the will of God, right? So, and you see now that these people are sending threats to this woman. They're threatening rape. When has rape ever been a just punishment for any crime? You know, there's a lot of things that we could be united for as an ummah. I don't think being united against somebody who points out a hadith that you all find acceptable, and now you're saying she's insulting the prophet. So if you found it acceptable, are you also insulting the prophet? I don't know. Maybe I'm not getting the whole issue here, but I don't see an issue, right? But anyway, the prophet married his adopted son's ex-wife, and the people didn't find this acceptable, but God found it acceptable because it's not his biological son, so it wasn't forbidden in the religion. So anyway, this is my take on this issue. Peace be upon you, folks.